In the cinematic movement known as film noir, there is an underdiscussed motif that comes in the form of a recurring moment. This moment can be found when the noir hero, its male protagonist, refuses the seduction of the femme fatale, or even his wife. What makes this moment more surprising is that it transforms the suave and hard-boiled characteristics of the noir hero, where his refusal of physical affection reveals a different side of the male protagonist, found in his grim concentration on the crime at hand. Before we can see how this motif reverses the power dynamic between men and women in noir, we'll first start with an example from the film Murder My Sweet. This moment comes between Philip Marlowe, the male protagonist, and Helen, the film's femme fatale. Before his romantic refusal of her, we see explicit evidence of Marlowe's flirtation and physical affection with her.
Amthor is blackmailing me.
Although he is skeptical of her, he doesn't let her affiliation with the crime affect his arousal until they meet the second time. Here, Helen attempts this same seduction, but this time, Marlowe is dead set on the crime.
No, you can't mean that.
During this second encounter, the film visually depicts Marlowe's suaveness regarding the conflict, rather than the previous encounter, which depicted his suaveness with romance. Logically, when they meet again here, he could have kissed her or given in to the flirtation for his own enjoyment, as seen before. But instead, he scares her away with his obsession over the crime at hand. Another film that uses this motif can be found in Kiss Me Deadly. Here, the audience is again presented with a scene that contrasts the male protagonist's obsession with the crime alongside the seductive aspects of the female character. Mike Hammer, the hypersexual, brutish, and charismatic male protagonist, visibly ignores his girlfriend Velda and her attraction towards him. This is a large departure from his character's previous actions, which involve contact with several females at various points. That is why his refusal is so apparent.
Avavum says that in Greek your name would be Mikhail Sephiros.
The moment that summarizes this motif of temporary asexuality comes when Hammer states,
"But under any other name would you be as sweet?"
Kowalski.
Which has nothing to do with Velda's seduction. This scene shows how the noir hero's grim concentration on the crime and conflict exceeds that of his sex drive, seen in the rift between Hammer and Velda's attitudes. So, one of two things is happening. Either he is refusing sex and physical pleasure to stay at his best, or he is momentarily incapable of such feelings. Either way, this reoccurring scene within noir interrupts the woman's sexual hold over the male protagonist, which complicates their dynamic of dominance and submission. A film that better shows this dynamic can be found in Tension. The motif happens between the protagonist Quimby and his unfaithful wife Claire, who is also the femme fatale.
Oh, golly, you can't do this, not to us.
The importance of his visual rejection of her speaks on the reversal of the femme fatale's power dynamic. As noted by Elizabeth Bronfen, the femme fatale has control over the noir hero because she has been expecting someone like him to fall for her. She knows all along that she is fated and can therefore turn what is inevitable, her fate and his fantasy, into a source of power. Since we know that this dynamic is possible in part by the male's sexual fantasy, we can understand how this applies to Quimby and Claire, since Quimby has literally fought for her acceptance at various points in this film. So, the moment this fantasy is destroyed in these scenes of rejection, the femme fatale is rendered temporarily powerless. The ultimate example of this reversal of power comes during the climax of Sunset Boulevard. Without going into detail on the mess of a love triangle that protagonist Joe Gillis is dealing with, this film interrupts Norma Desmond's hold over him through the usage of this rejection scene. Joe's overt aloofness as he walks by her, with literal death as a threat, is what connects this scene back into the noir hero's rejection of the femme fatale in favor of himself and the conflict at hand. This motif again contradicts the characteristics of Joe up until this point. This is because his refusal to face Norma or Betty emphasizes Joe's independence instead of his tendency to associate with them both for his financial and sexual enjoyment. Regardless of Joe's intentions to clean up this love triangle, he ends up choosing his own death by rejecting the love of these two women.
If you love me, Joe.
Whenever a noir film uses this motif, it results in a temporary contradictory status of the noir hero, since his previously defined hard-boiled attitude and sex drive are redefined by his grimness and concentration on himself.
You're leaving me.
Yes, I am, Norma.
In the film Pick Up on South Street, this reversed power dynamic is also seen, but in a way that unveils its connection to the production code. Although this film came out while the production code's control over cinema was weakening, the film's depictions of sexuality are interrupted by the usage of this rejection scene. Skip, who is the protagonist, is cemented as a man that is uncontrollable by seduction as he pushes Candy off of him. Candy is the film's femme fatale. What makes this refusal even worse is that we can see Skip's romantic interest in her until he asks about the crime.
How much did you bring?
That is how this motif does three things at once. Firstly, it showcases the protagonist's dedication to clues above his dedication to sex. Secondly, it destroys the femme fatale's control over the male protagonist in real time. And third, it meets the requirements of the production code by preventing sex from happening. That is how this motif can be realized as a manifestation of the production code. Otherwise, if the noir protagonist gave in to the woman during these scenes, then the audience would basically just be watching the beginning of a porno, where there is no more connection to the film's main conflict, just romance. It's a moment where the male protagonist's mind is not in the gutter, even though it often is. Now it's time to look at an example, not from noir, but from neo-noir, using the film Body Heat, which is an adaptation of the notorious noir film known as Double Indemnity. Since this film came out nearly 40 years after Double Indemnity, the differences in American culture can be found in the cinema's tolerance toward more explicit sexual imagery. This is proven through Body Heat's usage of the rejection scene, which is far more erotic than previous examples. The male protagonist, Ned Racine, and seductive femme fatale, Maddie Walker, lay together as Maddie confesses her love for him, which we know by now is to gain more control through sex. However, Ned refuses to even look at her, where he states,
I already think you're in the bottom.
So, right on schedule, the film follows in the footsteps of Noir, where the protagonist shows emotional distance from the woman and an obsession with the case. That is how Body Heat alters this motif to compensate for the more erotic and looser censorship of neo-noir, since they clearly just had sex. Returning back to Noir, another example of this scene can be found in The Killer is Loose. This film uses the rejection scene between Detective Wagner, who is the protagonist, and his wife Lila. Although Lila is not quite a femme fatale, at least the same way some of the others are, this scene still depicts the protagonist physically refusing his wife's wishes to focus on her, and not the crime at hand.
Then why can't we?
Lila.
Why?
Much like a femme fatale, Lila possesses a hold over Detective Wagner, out of his love. But in this scene, Detective Wagner prevents her hold from getting in the way of his conflict. That is how this reoccurring scene in Noir emphasizes the protagonist's dedication to the crime, to the point where his focus on the conflict exceeds that of his focus on women, whether it's the femme fatale or his beloved wife. This then destroys her control over him, even if it's just for a moment. Although there is some debate on whether noir can be considered a genre, through the examples we've seen and the others that were not shown, there were conventions that filmmakers were somewhat conscious of even before the French deemed this style as film noir. So, that is how this reoccurring moment of rejection appeared in a variety of film noir, from the movement's beginning all the way into its resurgence through the neo-noir of the 70s and onwards. Thanks for watching.